Hey everybody, this is Peter Giller with Bonny Doon Tools. We're here today to do the first part in a whole series of videos all about hydraulic forming. Essentially what I'm going to be doing is teaching the 2 or 3 day class that I've taught all around the country in a whole series of different videos. Today we're going to be going over the press, the terminology, all the parts, the components, how they work, how the different presses work, like the manual versus the electric versus the hand pump. We're going to be going over safety, and then we're going to go talk about pressure and talk a little bit more about how hydraulic forming works. All right, so first of all, what exactly is hydraulic forming? Essentially, it's a generic term for a ton of different metal processes that we do with a hydraulic press. So this includes everything from bending bracelets and rings to doing deep drawn vessels, all sorts of other die struck pieces. So let's go ahead, we're gonna jump over here. I'm gonna show you some examples just to give you an idea of what we're working on. Okay, so here we have a tray of a lot of different examples. So let's go ahead, we're just gonna start and go through here. Here is a bracelet that was roller printed and then formed on the press. We have some other examples, really thick stock bracelets. So just with the power of the press, you can form all sorts of materials, all sorts of thicknesses. Here's an overlay bracelet, nice thick sterling silver cuff, the synclastic shape. We have a little bit simpler synclastic cuff, again roller printed design. This was a pierced and kind of a much more delicate example, but forming it on the press went quick and easy, gives it a nice seamless shape. We have rings, so big, thick, complicated rings, things that are hard to do by hand, easy to do with the press. We have stuff like this example of things like this example of a die-struck sterling silver ring formed on the press. Here's another ring, big overlay piece in 12 gauge sterling silver. Then we get into doing stuff like silhouette dies. So these are the simplest of the dies, really nice puffed shapes, great for making hollow beads. You can even do this on a larger scale to make things like vessels. This locket from Phil Poirier, this was done using some non-conforming dies. So later on in the class, we're going to be getting into all these techniques. This again is a non-conforming die. Nice contra that's been stamped out. Have some really old dies here showing this earring example and the brass plate that it was done with. An aspen leaf non-conforming die. This is just a recent demo I did of a synclastic hollow ring. Another thing here is using what are called blanking dies. And blanking dies are a really efficient way to cut out various shapes. Great for lots of production pieces. Great for blanking out things like bracelets and rings as well. These are really cool. These are coins. So getting into much more detailed fine stampings. We can all do this on the press. Pretty much everything I'm showing you here, it can all be done on a 20-ton press as well. Here's some little stamped out fleur-de-lis. These are done with a conforming die, positive and a negative. And here we have some really nice 26 gauge silver hoop earrings. These can be formed with our Bonny Doon hammer or also formed on the press. And then last but not least is deep draw. Really cool way to create vessels, hollowware, seamless tubing in Mokame. This is great for ring makers. This is great for people who want to make vessels or hollowware. Also our 6-inch kit, you can do big pieces like this. So this is just a pre-drawn hemisphere that you can use then to create, bigger pieces. Take this and chase and raise it, or make things like boxes. So these are just some rough examples. We're going to be going through the class and we're going to be showing you, a little bit more in depth for all of these techniques and more. Right, so let's go ahead and start with press terminology. And what I have set up behind me here is 2 different 20-ton presses. We have the Mark III deep draw press, And we have our classic press. So both of these are 20-ton presses. They are our workhorse presses for forming, bending, doing deep draw. Again, all the examples I just shown you are done with these two presses. The only real difference between these two is that the Mark III is designed to do a 6-inch deep draw kit. Everything else we're going to be showing other than the 6-inch deep draw kit can be done on the Classic. The Classic can do a deep draw kit with a 3-inch diameter, creating vessels with a 1.75-inch diameter. So terminology, when we're looking at this, we're going to be talking about the press frame. That's this overall steel structure here. That is the frame that contains the pressure. So again, all of these products, all of these presses have been very well engineered and designed and welded to be way stronger than they need to be. So these are going to be the most rigid presses out on the market. And what that does is that gives you the best efficiency and the safest working capacity with these. So again, that's the frame. Here's the frame. Term we use a lot is platens. What the platens are the flat plates of steel. So this is our lower platen and this is our upper platen. Here you will see on the Mark III, we have, again, this lower platen, this is the upper platen, and the Mark III comes with a riser block. This is a removable spacer and platen that we can go ahead and we can pull out of there, giving us a lot more room to do big, deep drawn pieces. Otherwise, we keep the riser block in the Mark III almost all the time. So again, we've got the frame, we've got the platens, and here really is the important part. So this is going to be the cylinder. So this is the hydraulic cylinder, which is really what's doing all the work. On our electrics and our new manual hand pump, you're going to see this cylinder as shown here. On our classic manual, so this is just a hand pump, this has a hydraulic cylinder and a jack all built into one. So we're going to call this either usually the ram or the cylinder, or sometimes the jack. Over here, we have our electric pump. This is a super high quality, made in the USA pump. Essentially gives you the ability to do things a lot faster, more efficient, with less wear and tear on your body. Nice thing about this is for production and stuff, the cost of this pump is really going to make up for itself just in how fast you can work and how easily you can work. I'll show you guys later on. We also have this manual hand pump that's a really nice addition. I like to use the combo of an electric and I have the hand pump. You can swap them out really quickly. So if you need to do really fine detailed work that's really delicate low pressures, the hand pump is really nice. The electric pump is not quite as delicate, still can do pretty much the finest of things. And then our classic manual here, I'm going to see has a handle. So this actually goes in here, and this is how we pump up the press. On the manual, you're going to see right here, this little bit is our release valve. So after I pump up the manual and I want it to go back down, I'm going to open this up, and that's going to lower my platen. Now, not sure if you can see this in the video, I'll turn this. This is our pressure gauge. A pressure gauge is indispensable to being able to do repeatable and safe work. We need to know how much pressure we're putting into our pieces so that we don't exceed the limits of certain tools. And then for techniques like silhouette dies, we really need a gauge to be able to do repeatable results. And that way we can get the same high quality product out of the press at all times. So on the classic manual, we have the gauge right directly on the ram. Back here on the hand pump, the gauge is on the back, and on the electric pump, the gauge is also on the back. All right, so let's go ahead and jump over to the electric pump so I can show you a few details of that. All right, so here is the electric pump. And if we go and press this button, we see our press going up. Now, most of the time I'm working with this valve in the return position. That means that when I press the button, this goes up And when I stop, it's going to automatically release and come back down. Now, I'm going to go ahead, if I flip this, that's going to be hold. I don't use hold that often. We'll get into why we do use hold for certain techniques, but the hold is very useful for being able to do really delicate work on this electric pump. And what it means is when I press the button, it's going to go up and it's going to hold there. And it's just going to stay there until I release that. Okay, so now if we go over to the manual hand pump, this is a really nice pump. It bolts to your bench, has a good long lever arm, and this is how I'm going to pump up the press. The beauty of this compared to the other manual options is that it's a little bit faster to work with. In the back here is going to be my release valve, so when I want to go up, I got to make sure that's tight, and then you can see now, there you go, I'm pressurizing that gauge. When I want it to go back down, I'm just going to open this and release. One thing about these gauges, you will notice that they have glycerin in them. The glycerin is an important aspect of the gauge in that it protects it from shocks. Now, if we're doing a lot of blanking dies, there's still going to be shocks in the system, and we'll talk about that later on. It can cause the gauge to be damaged over time, but the glycerin really helps protect it. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about safety. This is oftentimes the thing that people worry the most about, and this can be a reason that people don't fully utilize their press because they're not familiar with the safety, they're not familiar with like the proper precautions to take. If you do things in the appropriate manner that we're going to be teaching in this class, this press is very safe, very easy to use, and very effective. So let's go ahead and go over safety. We like to use what's called the 5 C's. So the first C, that's the most important. This is something that if you're working in a jewelry shop, I think you should have on at all times, is eye protection. So cover is our first of our 5 C's. I'm wearing my safety glasses, and I'm always going to wear them when working on the press. The second C is column. So the way these presses are designed and engineered, this column houses the return springs. So the press needs pressure to return the hydraulic fluid and to remove the platen back down. So inside these columns are big, heavy-duty industrial springs, and they're housed within the column so that you can't pinch yourself with them, so that if there is ever a failure, which is very unlikely, that the spring is going to be enclosed in here. The other part of the column is when I am working at the press, I'm always going to be standing behind the column. So I'm kind of always going to orient myself right here. I can still see into the press from both sides, but if anything were to go wrong and break, I'm protected by this column. Same goes on the Classic. And that's also why I tend to orient my press at a slight angle on the bench. So the column is important. If you're working here, you can stay kind of safely behind here, and you can make sure that nothing goes wrong. The third C is going to be center. So anytime I'm working in the press, I want to make sure I keep my work objects centered in the press. Now, these presses are designed with a single pivot point to the platen. That's a really important aspect, and it's specifically engineered that way so that these platens are self-leveling. It's also designed so that if something were to go wrong, the platen is going to essentially tip at a lower pressure. So if I'm doing something and I'm pressing way over here on the corner, the press platen is going to essentially move to the side at a very low pressure. We don't want to build up high pressures and break stuff in here. So anytime I'm working on the press, I always want to make sure my workpiece is centered. Again, when I'm standing behind the column here, if I look from this side, I can look diagonally, make sure my workpiece is centered. I can look from this side, look diagonally, make sure my workpiece is centered. That's a very important part. The fourth C is going to be contain. And this is a bit complicated because not every process needs containment. But as much as we can, we're using containment devices in the press to contain our work. Again, if anything breaks or goes wrong, it's going to make that safer. So we'll go through each technique. We'll be talking about what the proper containment is. This is a high pressure steel containment die with polyurethane inside. We'll talk about polyurethane in a minute. And this is for forming. So this is an example of a container. And we have a couple other tools that have specified containers for that. And that's the 4 C's again. So we have cover, we have column, we have center, and we have contain. Our 5th C is common sense. That usually gets a chuckle out of people. Everybody knows common sense isn't all that common. I always like to say is don't work at the press when you're tired. Don't work at the press if you're under the influence of anything, whether that be you're just really hungry or whether you're on some sort of pharmaceuticals or other things like that. So make sure you're in a good frame of mind, you're alert, you're focused, and you're working on the press. When we go through all of the different techniques, there'll be little safety tips and tricks here. But again, I don't want anyone to be afraid of the press. It's a really useful tool. It can help you do things faster, more efficient. And if you follow all the safety protocols we go through, you will be good and you will be safe. All right, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about polyurethane. Polyurethane is really an incredible material that makes so many of these processes work on the press and gives us also the capabilities to do our work without marring the metal. That's the most critical part, and really I can't stress how incredible this polyurethane is. We work with a special supplier who has formulated these polyurethanes for all these processes. It lasts a really long time and it's a really high quality polyurethane. Now for each technique and tool and process we're working with, we're going to see different types of polyurethane. So what polyurethane is it's a polymer, but it's not compressible. It's incompressible, meaning it doesn't lose volume. So when we push our metal, our die into the polyurethane, it's going to conform to our workpiece, but it's going to also push that workpiece up into the die. We'll show you more details about this. I want to run through, first of all, just some of the different types of polyurethanes that we're using. We describe polyurethane with a durometer. The durometer means the hardness of the polyurethane. So our softest polyurethane is going to be either black or this natural color. It's a very soft polyurethane and it works really well for creating volume in pieces. Because it's softer, it tends to flow a little more easily, and so it helps us create big, large forms. However, we lose detail with the softer polyurethane. So depending on the process, we're going to be choosing different types of polyurethanes. Our middle grade polyurethane is going to be orange always, and this is called 80 durometer polyurethane. So again, the black and the natural is 60 durometer. The orange is 80 durometer, and this gives us a good middle point. It gives us a little detail in some processes, and it's going to still give us pretty good volume. Probably our most used polyurethane is red, or 95 durometer. This is a lot stiffer. It feels very hard, but this is going to be the most efficient polyurethane for forming bracelets and rings and doing stuff like that. So again, this is 95 durometer polyurethane. It's always going to be red if you're getting it from Bonny Doon. And we have this in all sorts of different makes. 1, 2, 3 block for forming bracelets, 3x3 for form box or also forming larger, wider bracelets. We have some thinner sheets here. And then most of our containers are going to come with the red polyurethane in them. These are for doing domed forms, synclastic bracelets, stuff like that. So that's 95 durometer. And then for people that are working with really thick, tough materials, contemporary materials like titanium, zirconium, Damascus, we have a 115D polyurethane. So it's 115 durometer, it's brown, and it's really, really hard. But that gives us the ability to form really thick, really tough materials on the press. All right, so let's go ahead and show you what the polyurethane actually looks like when it's been used. So I just have a strip of brass here. There you go. So you can see there that the polyurethane sort of swells around the die, flows around there, giving us nice seamless shapes. Now this is just a piece of brass, just a scrap that I grabbed. It doesn't really have any texture or engraving or anything like that. So you can't really see that the polyurethane, the beauty of that is that it's going to not mar your metal. So when we're looking at more complicated pieces, like this cuff bracelet here, the polyurethane gives us a nice seamless shape. Nice and clean, seamless shape here with no deformation. Okay, so let's go ahead and go over some of the basic tools, the essentials that we need to work on the press, and also how to attach tooling, how to work with the press. One thing I want to point out quickly here is all of our tooling uses a standard 1/4 inch hex key for most of the bolts. And this is how we're going to attach all of our tooling. I like to super glue magnets to the side of my press so that I can keep these handy here at all times. So we have a 1/4 inch hex key and we have a 5/32 hex key. This is for the master tool holder. And that will show you in just a second what the master tool holder does. But it's just a nice way to keep your tools organized. Sometimes I'll even magnetize a ruler up here just to have that handy when I'm working at the press. So all of the presses have 3 holes on the top platen. They're all standardized to fit various different tooling with a 5/16/18 bolt. So that's why we're using our hex key. So I'm going to reach up here. I can't see there, but I'm going to find that bolt and I'm going to go ahead and undo this bracelet fixture. You can see here is just the standard bolt. So there's 3 holes on here. And one of the most essential tools is going to be our aluminum platens. So 6 inch by 6 inch by 1 inch thick aluminum platens. And these are great to be able to take up space in the press. That's especially important when we're working with the manual press because we want to reduce how far up and down that goes. They also help protect our platens. So we want to wear out the aluminum, not the steel platens on the press. These are a lot cheaper to replace than it is to replace the platens. So I always have 2 of these at each and every press. Depending on what I'm doing, I'm going to swap these in here. There's a threaded hole in this so I can bolt it up to the top. So now this is really essential because if I'm doing very thin work, embossing on a pattern plate on the press or using blanking dies, I'm going to go ahead and use these to take up space. The presses are designed that they have a little bit bigger opening than the actual stroke of the ram has. So both of these rams have about a 6 inch stroke. However, this is 7 inches in here. This is 6 or 10 without the riser block. So when we're doing things like blanking dies, I'm going to always throw these in here. So if you kind of think about when you're working on the press, you always want to have a minimum of 2 inches of tooling. So if I'm doing something very, very thin, like pressing a piece of metal with some polyurethane, I'm going to have 2 spacers in here. If I'm doing something like forming a bracelet, this is already way more than 2 inches, so I don't necessarily need the spacers. Again, this depends on each and every setup, but 2 aluminum spacers with your press is really an essential tool to have. Again, on the manual, instead of having to pump this all the way up if we're doing something, I can throw 2 of these in there, and that reduces how far it has to go. On a manual press, I might even opt to have another couple of these just to reduce my cycle time as I'm going through whatever project I'm working on. So the aluminum platens are really an essential tool. The other one is going to be what's called our master tool holder. Essentially, this is a steel donut that bolts up into the top of the press, and it has a 1-inch diameter opening to hold any of our tools like mushroom formers and daps. So this is really a nice tool to have. Should have one with every press. If I unbolt this, you can see that, this has a single hole, so it bolts into the center there. It's a nice part about keeping things centered. Master tool holder uses the 2 outer holes on the top of the press. Just find the holes there, and then I'm just going to bolt that right up into there. Now, my 5/32 hex key, the reason I keep it magnetized here is because that goes into the set screw on the master tool holder so that I can secure my work in there. So say, for example, I'm working with a mushroom former. This is a 1 1/4 inch radius to it. This is going to go right up into there, and then I can tighten that down. Now, some of the other essentials are containers, and this really depends on what tools you're working with, but if you're working with mushroom formers and daps, you need either a 3-inch or a 2-inch container or a 4-inch container. Again, these all have red urethane in them for doing your forming, also for synclastic bracelets, stuff like that. So again, when we go through each and every technique, we'll be telling you what the best use of containers and urethane is. But depending on what you're doing, it's nice to have a couple containers around. And it's also nice to have a selection of different urethane. So we have a kit of 8 different types of urethane. And then for each and every tool, we also have various urethanes, like these little pucks that are more specifically designed for a single tool. All right, so when I'm teaching this class, I'm going to be teaching what is called process versus procedure. So if you're not familiar with what those terms mean, essentially procedure is like following a recipe. First you do step A, and then B, and then C, and you get this one single product out of the end of it. Say brownies, for example. When I'm teaching, I really like to focus on process, and that's the ideas behind the recipe. So the concepts. I want to teach you how metal moves, how to think about different gauges of metal, alloys of metal, and all of the techniques. And if you really are open to learning the process and you focus on learning the process, essentially that means that you can then do whatever you want. So ideally, I want you to be able to take your ideas and bring them to reality with a hydraulic press. So I'm going to be focusing on process. We're going to have demos in all the different videos that are showing specific examples. But really what I'm focused on teaching is the ideas behind the techniques. That way you can go ahead and take any of these tools, any of these techniques, and make what you want with them. All right, let's talk a little bit about pressure and how the hydraulic press actually sort of functions from a physics level. So these are 20-ton presses, which means that they are capable of generating 20 tons per square inch, or 40,000 pounds per square inch that we're pressing. So what we have on all of our pumps is essentially we are pumping 10,000 psi of hydraulic fluid pressure into a cylinder that has about 4 square inches of surface area. So that means that if we put a 1-inch cube of something inside here, we are now going to be generating 4 times 10,000. So again, 10,000 psi coming out of our pump, but because we're pushing that cylinder that has a surface area of about 4 square inches, we are going to generate 4 times the amount of pressure in the press per square inch. So we're going to do a quick demo just to kind of show how that functions. So here we have one of our rolling mill plates. Now the rolling mill plates, the pattern plates as we call them, they can be used in a rolling mill. We'll go ahead and we'll show that at some point here. But we're also going to show you how to use them in the press. Now we always like to say that you don't want to use the rolling mill plate in both the press and the rolling mill. And partly that's because once you use these plates a lot, they'll get curvature to them in the rolling mill. So this one's a good flat plate. We're gonna use this in the press to emboss. Now, I have this set up with 2 aluminum platens in here. That's because what we're gonna be pressing is very, very thin. So I need to take up that extra space in here. I have some 28 gauge brass here. This is just about 1 square inch. And I'm going to put that onto my pattern plate. And then I have 1/16 of an inch thick urethane, about the same size, about 1 square inch, that's gonna go on top of that piece. Now, as we go ahead and press this, the urethane is going to press my sheet down into the rolling mill plate, the pattern plate, and it's going to give us that texture on the sheet. All right, so you can see that I took that up to 8,000 on the gauge, so I didn't even go to the full pressure of the press. You can see that thin sheet was essentially formed over the texture, the details of that pattern plate. Now, let's do the same thing, but with a much larger piece of brass. Same thickness, 28 gauge. I'm gonna throw a bigger piece of polyurethane in there, and we're gonna press to the same pressure. Now, what I did was I spread that pressure out over a much bigger surface area. And by doing that, it means that I'm putting less pressure, less pounds per square inch into that brass. So this is one of the limitations of embossing with these pattern plates, is you're limited to how big and how thick of material you're working with. Understanding pressure in the hydraulic press is really important. Like we saw in that last demo, we were able to form the brass in the pattern plate when it was about 1 square inch. Now, when we scaled that up to about 10 square inches, all of a sudden that same 8,000 PSI, which is roughly 16 tons of force on the press, wasn't enough to form that brass. Now, the opposite is always also true. When we start working with smaller and smaller pieces, we actually start amplifying the pressure. So I'm gonna do a little demo here. I'm gonna do this safely from behind closed doors. This is not something you wanna try at home, but I'm going to take this little piece of hardened steel. The end of it is a 1/4 of an inch circle. Now, did the calculations on this. This is going to generate about 400 tons of force. That's right, 400 tons of force, and we're going to press it into this block of aluminum. Now, you see here in the video, as we squish, that 400 tons of force far exceeds the strength of the aluminum, and it pushes that piece of steel straight down into it. Now, this is important to know because you don't want to be working with tooling that isn't designed for the press. It is absolutely critical that everything you're working with in the press is designed to be used on a hydraulic press. These pressures really can amplify quite rapidly and cause destruction, as we just saw. So things like hallmarking stamps or these little kind of cheap dies, these cheap DAPs, do not want to be using these in the press. They can generate such high pressures very rapidly, past the point where you can control them, and not knowing how these tools are made, these tools can also fracture and go flying. So it's really important to understand the pressure. Let's just do a quick summary of what we've gone over today. First of all, process versus procedure. Again, in all of these videos, I'm really focusing on the process, the ideas behind all of the techniques. I really just want to be able to empower you and enable you to create any design you want. And really understanding that process is going to help you get there. Safety. Safety is very important. Never forget the 5 C's. Again, 5 C's we're going to go over is cover. Cover your eyes, whether it's eye protection or a face shield. Always center your work. Again, and when you're working in the press, always center what you're working on. Column. When I'm working on this, again, I want to be standing behind the column right here, looking in diagonally. Contain. I want to contain my work when appropriate and when it makes sense. So for each technique, you're going to contain your work as is appropriate. And common sense. You know, don't rush things. Don't say, oh, I'm just going to do this real quick and before I go home, because those are always the moments when things go wrong. So take your time, come back the next day and do it properly. Understanding pressure. This is probably the most important part about working with the hydraulic press. We're used to working with hammers and working with our hands, and in those techniques you can feel what's happening a little bit better. With the press and 20 tons of force, we can't feel that pressure quite as much. So again, if you have to review the pressure part of this video a couple times so that you really understand that, please do. Again, the bigger the surface area of your piece, the more spread out that pressure is. The smaller the piece you're pressing, the more amplified that pressure is going to become. So make sure you're always using tools that are designed for use in a hydraulic press and that you're not exceeding the recommended pressures for those techniques. Magic of polyurethane. I really can't say enough how amazing polyurethane is. Just its ability to form metal so well, so beautifully, without creases, without marring the metal, without bending it and giving it kind of funny things. It really does a great job. Polyurethane, again, we're going to have 60 durometer, which is meant for volume, and that's going to be natural colored or black. We have 80 durometer, it's kind of the middle ground, and then we have 95 durometer. 95 durometer helps us form thicker pieces and it gives us better detail. And then 115 durometer is going to be used for really thick, really tough materials. Essential tools, we always want to make sure to be using at least 2 inches of tooling in the press. If you're doing something very thin, make sure and use some spacers, aluminum spacers in there. If you're doing something like bracelet formers, you don't need this. But again, it's just a minimum of 2 inches of tooling in the press. So there's also going to be a lot of these resources, documents I have, handouts from classes, papers that we have written all about die making and all about using a hydraulic press. These are all going to be on the website. Again, that's BonnyDoonTools.com. That's getting uploaded little by little. So go check that out. More resources that can help you out understanding this. This first video is just a lot of me talking and a lot of information that is really important, although it might not be quite as fun. So I do promise all of the future videos, we're going to be getting a lot more hands-on and we're going to start delving into all of these different techniques. So what is to come is going to be summarized in 3 main processes: forming, coining, and deep draw. So forming is the most basic, and that is where we are taking a flat sheet of some kind and bending it over a 3-dimensional form. So that's going to be everything from bracelet forming and ring forming to working with non-conforming dies for doing stuff like lockets, working with silhouette dies, and also for doing things like this concho. The second process is coining. Coining is really the most detailed of all of the processes. And in coining, we are actually restructuring the crystal matrix of the metal. So we're extruding that metal into tool steel dies. It gives us tremendous strength, makes the pieces really easy to finish, and it gives us incredible detail. So it's quite involved. Making the dies is much more complex, but it is well worth the final product. And the third process is deep draw. So deep draw is a really incredible process. Dies are complicated, but we can take a 6-inch disc of silver like this piece here and draw it into a 3.5-inch diameter hemisphere. We can also make boxes, and we can also do seamless tubing. So this is really an incredible process. It's very quick, and it takes us from a flat sheet to tubes and vessels that we can work with for making things like rings or hollowware. So one of my favorite things about classes is getting to interact with students and people ask questions, and then you get to answer those questions. It brings up a lot of little tips and tricks and things like that. And sadly, we can't do that because you're all watching a video on your computer. So go ahead, post comments, post your questions. I'm sure there's a lot of questions out there. There's a lot to cover, and I will try to answer everybody's questions. I might post little shorts or videos in response to that. So yeah, please reach out, ask questions. Go to BonnyDoonTools.com as well, and you can get more info there. So thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We're gonna have a lot more videos teaching this all about hydraulic forming. So yeah, follow along, and yeah, happy pressing.